A couple of videos back, I did a one-shot on a fellow named King Critical, a TERF YouTuber who primarily does response videos to transgender allies. Naturally, I've been wanting to go after this guy for a while. After all, not only do I love debunking transphobes, but apparently he's the king of transphobes. If I can debunk him, I could probably debunk anybody. However, there was one thing that's been stopping me. You see, King Critical's videos are incredibly long, improvised, live stream commentaries, with very little editing. And considering many of the videos he goes after are also quite long, or he just has a lot to say about them, this means that, well, look at the time lengths of some of these. The only way I could really cover them is by trimming out so much that there wouldn't really be a point in covering them. However, there's one video of his that does not fall under this category, but still has essentially all of his normal talking points, and it also just so happens to be his most popular video. And that video is refuting ContraPoints in 17 minutes. J.K. Rowling. Response! And considering he's attempting to respond to a 90-minute, incredibly dense video in just 17, this can only go so well.
And I bring this up because I want to give you a sense of how this kind of transphobe talks when they're not afraid of Twitter backlash.
There's something very unsavory about reframing silence as duplicitousness when said silence often comes from a place of fear. It's quite the power move to bully women into being afraid to speak openly about their beliefs, and then attacking them as dishonest when they speak differently in private compared to in public.
For those curious, here's what Contra was bringing up.
The foundational TERF text is feminist professor Janice Raymond's 1979 book, The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the Male, in which Raymond argues that, quote,
all transsexuals rape women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact, appropriating this body for themselves.
She claims that trans women are agents of the patriarchy who, quote,
merely cut off the most obvious means of invading women.
This book set the general tone for feminist transphobia, and I bring this up because I want to give you a sense of how this kind of transphobe talks when they're not afraid of Twitter backlash.
To begin with, Raymond wasn't speaking in private, she was writing these thoughts in a book that she then published and sold. Oh, also, Contra isn't accusing TERFs of being duplicitous. She's accusing them of euphemizing their beliefs in hopes of making them more palatable to the general population, which are entirely different claims. I just want to point out, by the way, that the things women are being bullied out of saying include, but are not limited to, calling trans women she-males and saying they rape women's bodies. You know, you'd think the trans rights movement would start by bullying women out of calling them men, considering that's the central tenet of transphobia, but I guess not.
General note. Okay, so sometimes Contra will talk generally about a topic, so in that case, rather than playing everything said, I'll just flash up that general note message. So throughout the video, Contra frequently implies the gender-critical position is bigoted by drawing circumstantial and superficial parallels to other movements. For example, pointing out that gender-critical people wish to achieve their goals incrementally and then saying, that's just like what anti-abortion people do.
And like the anti-abortion movement, they recognize it's not yet politically practical to completely make illegal a medical procedure they don't like, so they settle for making it as difficult as possible to get one.
Okay, even according to the clip you played, you misrepresented what Contra said. She wasn't just merely comparing the fact that the anti-abortion crowd and the anti-transgender crowd are incrementalists, but was more specifically making the point that the reason why they're incrementalists is because their ideas are currently not palatable to a large amount of the population. There's a fundamental difference between being an incrementalist because you endorse such radical change that you understand society as a whole cannot be reconstructed overnight, and being an incrementalist because your ideas are so widely unpopular that you know incrementalism is the only thing that you're ever going to get political success-wise.
Obviously that's pretty silly reasoning, and I don't think anybody should take that type of argument seriously.
Oh my god, you're defensive. Contra wasn't making an argument, she was just drawing a comparison between two political movements.
Okay, so this chart is a bit complicated, but I just want to point out a few issues. Firstly, while believing in Zionist conspiracy theories is pretty anti-Semitic, Opposing Zionism in general while not being against Jewish individuals is totally valid.
When did Contra say otherwise? She's talking about how bigots depersonify the target of their bigotry. There's nothing wrong with opposing Zionism as an ideology, on the condition that really is all you're doing. However, depersonifying Jewish people as Zionists or Zionism is bigotry.
The problem really is the conspiracy theory aspect, which is the problem with all the other positions listed, except for the gender-critical position, which isn't a conspiracy theory.
Out of curiosity, what's conspiratorial about the term feminazi, especially considering it's just a hyperbolic slang term for a particularly extreme feminist? For that matter, what's conspiratorial about the concept of the friend zone? It just means that a woman sees you too much as a friend to want to date or have sex with you. Both terms have been abused by misogynists, I won't deny that, but they aren't conspiratorial.
I should also point out that this chart would fall under the category of drawing superficial parallels between different movements to imply they're all the same in some deeper sense. Again, that's very silly.
Why? Oh, he doesn't answer that question at any point in this video, by the way, just so you all know. But he does make that point multiple times.
In fact, I would argue that feeling threatened is the distinctive psychological experience of bigotry, much more so than feeling hateful.
So not only does Contra argue with these weird, sweeping, superficial parallels, but also often argues with weird moral implications. Like, any threatening movement could use the exact logic Contra is using right now. White nationalists could argue that Black Lives Matter is bigoted because they feel threatened. And you know who else feels threatened? Bigots. Now, I'm not making that argument because I'm not Contra, but that's what Contra's logic would allow for.
Quick question, what's the difference between what King Critical has gotten on to Contra for doing, that being drawing superficial parallels between groups, and King Critical drawing a superficial parallel to what Contra said and something a white supremacist could hypothetically say? Well, I'll answer that question. In Contra's example, it was based off of what people do actually say, not based off of what they could maybe hypothetically say. But you're right, a white supremacist could theoretically say this. So what? This is nothing more than guilt by hypothetical association. And by the way, a white supremacist claiming that would still be wrong because, well, who's Black Lives Matter bigoted against? The police? I mean, they do feel threatened by police, don't get me wrong, but that's because police engage in brutality against minorities. That's the entire point of the movement. But even then, Contra never said that feeling threatened makes you a bigot, but that bigots claim to feel threatened. Again, those are two entirely different claims.
And now, you're immediately getting baited into some bullshit semantic debate about what is a real woman. It doesn't really matter, does it?
I would like to know if Contra thinks it matters whether or not being trans has any sort of meaningful definition.
It just means not cis. That's it.
Because if you're going to advocate for trans rights, I would think that what it means to be trans matters quite a lot.
I mean, if pedantically attempting to define what it meant to be transgender was getting in the way of actually advocating for the rights of transgender people, then yeah, I imagine Contra would be saying essentially the same thing. In fact, the people who most insist on there being some kind of strict definition of what it means to be transgender are trans medicalists who are not really looked highly upon in ContraPoint's community.
Right. What about being black? Does that have any definition?
Well, race is a social construct, and attempts to create a coherent definition regarding what it means to be black have led to things like the one drop of blood test, the paper bag test, and putting a pencil in somebody's hair in order to see what race they are. I am not kidding, they did that in apartheid South Africa. So, no, it doesn't.
Look, trans people can't even agree among ourselves what gender is. In fact, if you even try to answer the question, you end up enraging some part of the community who feels excluded.
So honestly, at this point, the intellectual side of this debate is pretty wrapped up. Contra is admitting not only an inability to arrive at a satisfying definition of gender or defense for that definition, but also saying that this is true for the wider trans community.
No, she's just making the point that the wider trans community has various definitions of gender and not all of them agree with each other.
So if you care about having a definition of gender that makes sense and is coherent and can be agreed upon by people, then Contra is basically admitting that you shouldn't buy what's being sold here.
Yup, if you want a simplistic and dogmatic worldview, this is not the side for you. Glad we can agree on that.
Joanne is projecting her own memories of troubled adolescence onto trans men, and then saying, oh, clearly they were going through the same things I was, just someone persuaded them to transition.
I'm going to blast through a lot of Contra's response to JK's article, because I already responded to Vorsh's attack on JK in this regard, so I will have a link to that now. I do just want to say that JK is mostly thinking out loud here. She's wondering if maybe it's possible that growing up as a woman under patriarchy might be a contributing factor to the desire to be a different gender, which is an intuitively reasonable argument that deserves a fair response.
Really? Because intuitively, my first questions would be, why is it only happening now, considering essentially every society in all of existence has been patriarchal, and why is it happening in the closest things to egalitarian societies we have today? Mind you, how much intuitive sense something makes doesn't actually matter. Intuitively, a flat Earth makes more sense than a round Earth, a stationary Earth makes more sense than a rotating Earth, and a geocentric universe makes more sense than a heliocentric universe. We know this because when people had nothing more than pure intuition to rely upon, these were the conclusions they drew. Do you believe all of these ideas are worthy of response simply because intuitively they make sense? And if so, when's your debate with the Flat Earth Society?
I think whenever a little girl on the playground picks up a toy truck, an endocrinologist pops out from behind a tree and says, "We've got a nonconformist on our hands, Johnson. Stand by, I'm gonna trans him."
Again, this argument is very, I guess, immature, unappreciative of nuance.
Contra wasn't making an argument, though. She was engaging in what we in the trans rights movement have dubbed a joke.
Well, it's not as if every single slightly gender non-conforming girl is immediately turned into a trans man. So I bet J.K. Rowling feels stupid for suggesting that might sometimes be a contributory factor.
You know, you say this claim deserves a response, but what you actually describe the claim as is so vague that you can't respond to it. So it might, we don't know, it only might, sometimes, meaning not in every case, be one of multiple factors that leads to medical transition. You can say that about literally anything. With how unfalsifiable this claim is, you could replace people transition because of patriarchy and gender nonconformity with people transition because of invisible dragons, and it would make just as much sense. Side note, if you guys want to see the exact same concepts being discussed here, analyzed through Carl Sagan's famous invisible dragon hypothetical, I actually did that on Medium. Link in the description.
Whereas I feel like transmasculine people are less vilified, but so infantilized.
Couldn't this accusation be leveled at any social movement that understands systemic oppression as impacting human choice? Like, you could just as validly say that feminism infantilizes women by acting as if a lack of female representation in STEM fields disinclines women to engage in STEM fields. What, are women just big babies who can't choose to enter into STEM fields for themselves? I'm not really impressed by any argument that appeals to the existence of human agency as a response to people making points about structures of oppression. This is exactly what Contra is doing here, saying these infantilizers are suggesting that patriarchy might incline some women to view themselves as men, but actually trans women are adults with self-agency who can decide they're men for themselves, thank you very much.
So, women are being systemically oppressed into becoming transgender. Did I understand what you just implied correctly? Oh, I'm sorry. They might sometimes be getting systemically oppressed into becoming transgender along with other factors. I don't even know how to properly respond to that because I'm not even sure how to address such a ridiculous claim. But you know what? I'll try, because the main issue with that claim is, well, it doesn't make any sense. Patriarchies are set up specifically for the purpose of power structures. If a woman could leave that power structure, the power structure is essentially meaningless. To put it another way, the fact that this can even happen under a patriarchal society is evidence this claim is incorrect.
General note. Contra talks about troubled blood. This was definitely the hardest moment for me to not just nitpick every single little thing said. However, I just want to point out that Contra never acknowledges the obvious point that JK says she got into this discussion because of a book she was researching, presumably this book. Contra, like a lot of others, presents it as if this book emanates from JK's recent support for gender-critical positions. We don't know how, why, or when JK came up with this idea, but according to her, she began to formulate ideas around transgender identity politics in response to research she did for this book.
Okay, here's how troubled blood is introduced in Contra's video.
I should probably talk about the book, since I did go to the trouble to read all 900 pages, because unlike certain other YouTubers, I do in fact know how to read. Troubled Blood was published in September 2020 by Joanne Rowling under her pen name Robert Galbraith.
What follows is primarily a discussion about the transgender serial killer trope, put together with what we can determine regarding J.K. Rowling's views about transgender people from Troubled Blood. Nowhere is if she got these views before or after doing research for Troubled Blood even mentioned.
This is Orwell's nightmare? This is how Nazi Germany started?
Okay, so I think the free speech point is worth taking a brief second to address. I'm not aware of any other dubious claim that is enforced in the way that trans women are women is. So while I generally reject talk of Orwellianism on principle because of how overblown it is, 1984 was mostly about policing language by getting people to accept expressions that didn't make logical sense. So there is an equivalence there.
Okay, this probably isn't the most relevant point to make, but the point was the language did make sense to the people of Oceania. Plus, many examples of Newspeak had double meanings, which again made perfect sense from the point of view of the totalitarian party. For example, War is Peace was actually a reference to how the party keeps itself stable through waging perpetual warfare. Hell, if you want to play the game of 1984 in language, let me just ask, which one of our sides has very strict definitions, and which side, according to this video, remember, has free-flowing and fluid ones that even members of the side cannot quite agree on?
You sure? That's why people call Magdalene Burns a bigot? Are you sure she hasn't said anything else about trans women that might lead people to think she's less than hugely sympathetic?
Spoiler alert, Contra is about to take the words of a woman who is angry, justifiably, and use this to reframe that woman as a horrible person who's the real bigot. So much for the tolerant feminists, I guess. Ultimately, you can dismiss any political movement if you're willing to frame frustration with oppression as irrational and hateful anger.
Contra hasn't been dismissing the movement, though. She's simply responding to the claim that Magdalene Burns was hugely sympathetic. Angry movements can make good points. I imagine Contra would not disagree with that sentence.
General note. More generally, Contra spends a decent chunk of time engaging in a he said, she said thing, where Contra suggests that it's the gender-critical people doing all the attacking and being horrible. But meanwhile, we know that gender-critical women feel that it's the gender identity extremists who are always attacking them and being horrible to them. Given that it would be difficult to quantify which side is worst in this debate, and moreover, that to even establish which side is worst wouldn't have any bearing on the truth of the claims on offer, I'm far more interested in which side has the best arguments.
This is the level of antipathy that I attract from trans Twitter.
But I will say that it's telling that many trans activists have experienced hatred and attacks from other trans activists.
First off, I thought you weren't going to talk about which side is meaner because you don't think it matters. And second off, oh no, we aren't a centralized hive mind. And as a result, some of us say things that others disagree with even within the movement. Oh God, no!
From what I've heard from trans activists, there's a very consistent thread of them being pretty much afraid to express any deviation from a very particular set of claims and beliefs.
Really? Who are they? Now seriously, you brought them up. Tell us who they are and what they were afraid of saying. Anyway, that's all I want to cover, so final thoughts? Well, to be honest, the most I can give would essentially come down to me screaming into a pillow. Good night, and good luck.